Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or wherever you may be amongst the listenership and viewership of this year's 30th annual Arab-U.S. Policymakers Conference. We're pleased and proud to have been able to go this far with the support of friends and allies and others who are aligned with what the National Council seeks to accomplish. This particular session promises to be one of the liveliest because of the individuals who will comprise the panels of spokespeople who are long household names in the region and beyond because of the extent and the nature and the background and the context of their professional careers. We are starting with the chairperson, Richard Kaplan, who's a member of the National Council's International Advisory Board. He can be likened in a way to the Marco Polo of print and broadcast media news networks. He's been affiliated, associate as executive producer of CBS, ABC, CNN, and MSNBC, and has worked with such luminaries as Walter Cronkite, Katie Couric, Diane Sawyer, Ted Koppel, and Peter Jennings. I will turn the floor over to Richard Kaplan. We're honored to have him now for the second year in succession to play a role by bringing together these extraordinarily experienced, personally professional media personalities. More than that, they're scholars, they're analysts, they're educators. Richard Kaplan.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. In fact, let me begin by thanking the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, and especially you, Dr. Anthony, and our founder, and to Pat Mancino, thank you as well for this invitation, and to Roland Robinson for all of his help. We hope we have a very spirited hour for you. I pray that all of you who are joining us virtually are in good health, and that next year, if COVID goes along with us, we can meet in person, because it's much easier to do this when we're all looking at each other in the same room. Mm-hmm. And it's been our practice every time we meet, we begin this session with just a simple what now? Arab-U.S. relationships, as you all know, are complex and forever changing, and are greatly affected by any change in the world order. So while ultimately our focus must include the lands of the Middle East to Persia to Asia and all the points in between, as is always said at meetings like these, this is a unique moment in our history. It's the first time in decades that I can remember having a period where the United States is not involved officially in a land war in the Middle East. And and while it's not to say we're not involved in all of the intrigues and the goings on in the region, we see evidence now of every state's ability, frankly, to conduct its own wars anytime they see fit. And it's a much more dangerous time, I think, than ever before. Questions like, what is Iran up to? Will the nuclear treaty survive? What is going to happen in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, Afghanistan, Jordan, Israel? Will the United States stay engaged? And this is where we're going to begin. Will the United States stay deeply engaged, or will it be distracted by a troubling relationship with China, or a more threatening one, even with Russia? The list is long, and the number of questions we have to consider is even longer. So joining me is a very distinguished panel of journalists, educators, and experts who have diplomatic experience and expertise in all things Middle East. I'm going to introduce our guests as we come to them, and all of you are invited to send in questions as the conversation continues. If you want to send in questions, please send them to questions@ncusar.org. That's questions@ncusar.org. USAR.org, and we're going to try to include them in our conversation. So let me begin by going to Dr. Abdurrahim Fakira, who is the Washington bureau chief for Al Jazeera. And he's the host of MIN, which is one of the most successful programs, information programs in the Middle East. They take a look at an in-depth analysis of US affairs and their impact on North Africa. And I'm sure you probably caught him, as he's also a commentator occasionally on Face the Nation, CNN, and NPR. So Dr. Fakara, or Mr. Fakara, Dr. Fakara, now that we see the United States seemingly mesmerized by and co-opted almost by the situation with China, and we had this continuing situation with Russia, do you see the Biden administration pulling back from paying as much attention as it has in the past in the Middle East? What do you see the future there?
Rick, thank you very much. I do have a PhD, but please make it easier. You can just call me Abed, A-B-E-D, if you like. Let me also start by thanking the National Council on Arab Relations. And since Dr. Anthony opened the door of serious levity by metaphorizing you into Marco Polo, let me also greet him, say thank you. Hollywood has its Duke, John Wayne. We in DC, we have our own Duke, Duke Anthony. John Wayne has a gun and bullets. Dr. Anthony has brains, and we're very grateful for that. To your question, Rick, let me just start with a general statement about the Middle East. I'm not a historian. I'm primarily a journalist, an Arab journalist from Washington, D.C., who has a passion for U.S. relations with the Arab world, with the Middle East, whether it's Arab or otherwise. So let me say this about the region. Long before the U.S. got involved in the Middle East, long before the U.S. actually existed as a country, many centuries ago, the Middle East has always been a focal point of attention, because it has always been, as we know, it's a fact of geography, at the intersection of different routes, whether they are trade routes or influence routes. The three monotheistic religions have, their cradle there in the Middle East. So regardless of empires and global powers, the Middle East has always been what it is today. It's always been an important part of the world. And whether it has been controlled by its indigenous civilizations or by civilizations foreign to the region, it has always been important. And you can go through the world powers and empires, beginning with the Roman Empire, even long before the Roman Empire, but talk about the Roman Empire, talk about the British Empire, talk about the Ottoman Empire, talk about current American power. That place has always been a particular place of interest to human history. I do not see how that could change fundamentally now that the US or that President Biden is talking about China as being the primary concern of the United States moving forward, especially now that the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. Obviously, I personally hear mutterings in various Middle Eastern countries, and these mutterings are questions about, the extent to which the US will stay committed to the Middle East now that it's trying to focus more on the challenges of China. The US is unique in the sense that it has had relations with the Gulf at one extremity of the Middle East, of the Arab world, and it has had a long ongoing relationship with the other extremity of the Arab world. Morocco was the first country to recognize the independence of the United States. The US fought its first war as an independent country from the British Crown off the coast of Libya. And, you know, there are many, many examples that seem to indicate that the nature of the attention or the degree of the attention that the US may be paying to this part of the world moving forward may change, but it will not fundamentally alter its nature, whether you're talking about the economy, whether you're talking about security arrangements, whether you're talking about other spheres of life, even in terms of vaccines and helping the countries of the region deal with the COVID problem. So in short, obviously the US is bound to continue paying attention to the Middle East because we see obviously China increasingly interested in the region. We see Russia also increasingly interested in different parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So if only to counter the Russian and Chinese interest in the region, the US has to stay focused in terms of its commitment to the region. But even without China, even without the threats of competition from the Chinese and the Russians, for example, and there are others such as the Indians, for example, the US will, in my estimation, continue to be interested in the region, and that interest is per se to start with because of these long-standing relations with the region. Just one more thought, if I may add one more thought to this. It seems to me that the US, as a political power, as a political structure, came from the womb of Europe. The British, the French, and so on. Whether you're talking about politically or philosophically, when you look at the US Constitution and what the French influences had to do with it. And therefore, it's very difficult, as long as the US continues to see a vital interest in the stability of Europe and in cooperation with Europe, it will, in my estimation, by definition, continue to see a vital interest in its relations with the Middle East, whether you're talking about the Gulf, whether you're talking about the Levant, or whether, since North Africa has more proximity to Europe, you're talking about US relations with North Africa. They're not as strong as they are in terms of relations between the US and the Gulf, for example, or the Gulf and Israel, or the Gulf and Egypt, but they are still very, very profound and very important relations for the US with that part of the world, sitting just across the Mediterranean from Europe. So I
don't think anybody disputes that the Middle East will always be in our sights, but there are immediate problems with China and what could blow up over Taiwan. There are problems with China and its new missile systems that it's developing, and we have questions about whether they're first strike or not. And there are things that are immediate that are maybe more pressing, and we're just looking out for the next year. It's a time, because of the elections, where the president will be looking for a place he can go for even a small victory, because domestically, I doubt that he'll get much done in an election year. and it's tough to figure out what the president will see the benefits of really engaging in a strong way, excuse me, with the Middle East. So let me move the conversation to Khaled Almaeena, who's the former editor-in-chief of Arab News and Saudi Gazette, and get down to the street level a little bit. What do you think is the conversation there about the United States participating? We have pulled out of Afghanistan. Does that help our situation or not?
Well, I think just to backtrack, I don't think anyone here is for cutting all relations with the United States. The impact of American policies even in intra-Arab relationship is very paramount. For years, many of the Arab states were towing the American line in the Cold War. We had the Baghdad Pact. We had other, pacts known and unknown with the United States. But I think there's a sense that the United States and some of the policymakers in the region believe that the 82nd Airborne Division is always there to save us. I think the man in the street and even people in think tanks and those in power, many of them believe that the Arab states have there's maturity, that there is a sense that we can go on our own. Now people, and as Dr. Foucault said, there's muttering on the street. Yes, there's a large segment, if not a majority, who believe that the United States should be there. I'm one of them. We would like to have good relations with the United States. We want friends, not masters. We want people who would help advocate a new beginning, help in societal recognition of what's happening, help in building up alliances that focuses on the economy, on social affairs, on getting things done, helping this youth, helping us in our educational system. But, to be viewed as just the USA's favorite boy is sort of upsetting. And now people go back, and Dr. Foucault also went back, and I have great respect for him, going back to our long-term relations. Things change. The images of the past are not the images of the future. There's a young generation out there. There are people who are more gung-ho. It's sad that the Middle East, despite its brimming coffers, lacks one thing which money can't buy, and that's leadership. So for years, the inter-Arab fightings, the revolutions, the changes of government and all did not create a viable solution where we could meet and talk at par with the United States. We do not want to be client states. And this is it. I agree with you that the United States has an interest. We want to be treated equal. We are not an ATM machine or a gas station. That's what I always say. But there are here people who say that we can do without the United States. I say that we can do with the United States if we are treated properly, if the rights, the basic rights of our people, if there are things that are festering wounds here, like the Palestine problem, like other issues are taken care of, and America be viewed as an honest broker, then I think yes. Otherwise, there are many who scoff at the idea of US being the watchman of the area.
Well, let me pick up on that. Did the way we pulled out of Afghanistan hurt our view, hurt what people thought of us? Is the United States still considered reliable?
I don't think so. It is considered reliable. But yes, I agree. The immediate pullout of Afghanistan, the way it was done, not only Afghanistan, on many other issues. There are many people who read history well enough to know what the United States did. This is not sort of criticizing or attacking the United States because it has its own interests. And as you said early on, China is a major issue, is a big thorn in the American throat. The area here is comparatively peaceful in that sense. So yes, to give a direct reply, it sort of caused alarm as if this can happen to an ally, to a country where trillions were spent and you pulled out. But the question remains, and young people and others ask, why should we just depend on the United States? I think this is a country, 300 million people. If there's a semblance of unity among the Arabs, if they focus on joint economic, trade, relations, education, I think we will need the United States as a partner in progress and not as a policeman.
I see. Let me bring in Ms. Genevieve Abdo, and she's a visiting fellow at the Gulf States Institute in Washington and a World Bank consultant and author of a number of books, among them The Arab Uprisings, The Rebirth of the Shia-Sunni Divide. Ms. Abdo, I'm going to ask you to talk about Iraq and Iran, because we have even a longer relationship with them directly than even with Afghanistan. And, they saw what went on, and we've just had a very telling election in Iraq. Do you think that this election was a game changer? Did it change people's attitudes about the United States? What do you think we're going to be able to do to try to prevent Iran from totally co-opting the new Iraqi government?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Anthony, for the invitation. And I think that Iraq, the election is a huge example of how the region can change and how countries can change, and particularly relevant to the point of the younger generation. Everyone predicted this election would not be a game changer, but in fact it was. It not only brought in the most seats to the parliament by Muqtada Sadr, who has not necessarily been a great friend of the United States, but he has stated since his coalition's victory that he wants to work with the United States, that he's very much against Iran's involvement in Iraq. And probably more importantly, the election showed that a younger generation of Iraqis really determined the changing dynamics. Independents won a large seat of votes. They won 37 seats. The parties from the demonstrators also won seats. And the Iranian factions lost seats. So they are now in a much worse position with only 16 seats than they were in the last election. So we have seen a total change in the political dynamics in Iraq, largely because of the demographics, a younger generation, largely because this younger generation, actually, they have very mixed views of the United States, which are very complicated. They are very much interested in positive U.S. engagement. They're not interested in the U.S. military presence in Iraq, but they're interested if the United States and the EU can develop Iraq economically, can develop the infrastructure in Iraq. And so they're very, very clued into the world and to global relations, and they're not necessarily anti-American. And I think that this is something that's very important to understand. They're also very much in favor of an inclusive political system that really hasn't been the case in Iraq. So we've seen since the 2003 invasion, a political system that's basically been run by Shia political elites from an older generation. And this is what was voted out of office. So I think that it's a great opportunity for the United States to start a new relationship with Iraq. And it's also a great opportunity to shift the balance of Iranian influence in Iraq. The people who were voted out of office, in fact, are the Shia-backed militias who also have political parties who have been launching targets at the United States now for several years. So the younger generation made a big point in their demonstration movement that began in 2019 that they no longer want Iranian influence in their country. And they did this at great peril. Many were assassinated. people have been kidnapped and disappeared that have still not been accounted for.
Well,
Something
precisely. It's not so much the 16 seats that concerns most people. It's that Iran is a mischief maker, if you will. That's really understating it. Their ability to create allies using their terrorist tools, that concerns people. The bombings concern people, deaths concern people, not votes as much. So where is that going? I mean, they won't be, as in, you think that'll combat terrorism?
We have seen since the election that the violence has been used in retaliation for the results of the election. But we have also seen that the Iranian-backed militias and their associated parties have been discredited. So I think that, of course, the violence will continue against people such as the young demonstrators and their parties that won the elections and U.S. interests, but there's no support for that. So these Shia militias now are sort of operating in a vacuum. And I think that that's very important to understand, that Iraqi public opinion has taken a position and it's shifted away from Iranian influence, which is very good news for the United States.
You know, I think there are doubts amongst the American public when they look at this and sometimes don't understand why there isn't a greater outpouring of anger when there's a terrorist bombing, whether it be a taxi cab or a car bomb or an IED. And they question whether any of this really has an impact on broader relationships. I think it handicaps us in many ways.
Rick?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd say something about that indirectly, if I may. I'd like to make an indirect point, link into the remark that you've just made. But I would like to go back to the issue of young people that we've heard about from both Mr. Khaled and from Geneive. You know, the Arab relations with the United States, Arab relations with the West in general, are full of, obviously, complexities. That's obvious. They're also full of ironies and paradoxes. One of those ironies is that the Arabs in general have for a long time resented certain aspects of U.S. foreign policy, the way the successive U.S. relations have dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian issue is one example. Although there's been, you know, a series of stages of normalizing relations with Israel, but, you know, there has been resentment about that in the Arab world for a long time. Another aspect of that resentment is U.S. support, whether it's perceived or real, for authoritarian regimes trying to thwart democracy in the Middle East. And go back to 2011, to the so-called Arab Spring. I mean, it was mostly about change, and it was mostly about people's passion for change and for democracy. And that's the irony of the situation, that you have resentment of the US on the one hand for, you know, a whole litany of different reasons, but you also have this admiration for Western democracy, which does not always support the democratic drives in the region. So, as I said, that's one of the ironies. I think, you know, the US is obviously facing a lot of challenges supporting democracy. Let's just look at the challenge currently in Sudan, for example, just as one among many examples. But the crucial factor moving forward in terms of whether the Arab world favors China over the US, whether the Arab world will ever favor China over the US, Well, it seems to me that one of the crucial determinants is what happens here in the US as well. I mean, we have seen in recent years examples of political events that have shaken the faith of many an Arab in US democracy. And it seems to me that to the extent that the US political system continues to be perceived as democratic to one degree or another, will determine the extent to which Arabs will continue to be excited or interested in working with the US, not as vassals, as we heard from Mr. Khaled at the outset, but as partners. Because I would be hard put to it to conceive of a scenario in which Arabs who were very enthusiastic for democracy would wish to get their democratic credentials from a country like China or Russia. And that, it seems to me, is one of the pillars of this edifice that has been going on between the Arabs and the West for a long time, an edifice of resentment and admiration at the same time. But as long as the US continues to project an internal image which is consistent with the Arabs' view of democracy and how it's practiced in the US, I do not see how China or Russia could be a serious threat to the partnership that Arabs would like to have with the United States moving forward.
But doesn't the problems that the administration and Americans are having just coming to any kind of agreement, we're going to fix our highways now, but isn't the difficulties and the stalemate in Washington, doesn't that give people pause in the Middle East when they sit there and say, who are we going to be able to count on? There's probably going to be a change in the leadership of the House and the Senate potentially in the next election. And then, if they're looking ahead, what do they think? What do they do?
I mean, the Arab governments, if we're talking about governments in particular here, Arab governments have always adjusted to the changes at the White House, the changes of administration. And I do not see why that would be different in the future.
Well, Americans are having a problem with this change now. There's a 35 or 40% of the country questions whether we even have the right guy in the White House based on the election.
Well, I mean, that's precisely my point. My point is that if US democracy continues to go through the serious trials and tribulations that it has been going through over the last 2 to 3 years, that raises serious doubt in the minds of Arabs who are enthusiastic for democracy, because there are Arabs who are not particularly interested in democracy. They do not see it as leading their countries to where those countries should be. But to the extent that there are Arabs, young Arabs in particular, who are interested in a democratic future for their countries, they're going to be watching very closely the trials and tribulations of democracy in the United States. What happens here will determine, to me, at least with some parts of the Arab world, the nature of the relationship that the US will be able to maintain with that part of the world moving forward, even as it focuses on China.
Mr. Almaeena.
If I could just...
Oh, yes, go ahead.
If I could just introduce a different kind of perspective. I mean, I think that one of the great deficiencies of US policy for at least the last 20 or 30 years that was never adjusted or addressed by the Arab uprisings is that there's too much focus on US state relations, and there's not enough focus on US relations with Arab societies. And we tend to talk, as we're doing in this conversation, about the relationship with the Arab world, with the Middle East being based totally on governments. And in fact, I think that there are many countries now, to speak about democracy, there are many countries that where societies are sort of restrained by their autocratic governments. And so whatever their desires for democracy or not, we don't really know about, because their governments are autocratic and there's no free expression, there's limited free expression. So I think that we have to address with the same value and importance the relationship between the United States and governments and the relationship between the United States and Arab societies.
That's a good
because
point.
There is now a difference.
Ms. Almaeena, what do you think?
Well, I think there's a dichotomy, and I agree with what Dr. Fukara said. No longer is the United States viewed as an example for democracy. We have seen what happened. We have seen what happened at the Capitol Hill and all. And the young Arabs are having second thoughts. And some people say different strokes for different folks. I think what the Arab world needs to do, both those in power and the people, the ordinary people, intellectuals, societal leaders, would be to create our own and evolve our own form of governance, our own KPIs, rather than look up to the United States. But again, I would say that it does not mean that being disappointed with the United States, we will start looking elsewhere towards Russia or China, which are societies and systems that are quite abhorrent to our own way of life. Because even as a young man, when there was a Cold War was going on and the tussle between the United States and the Soviet Union, many Americans many Saudis, Gulf people, the Arabs in particular, looked towards America to migrate, those who wanted to migrate, to study like people from the Gulf. So we view America with respect. We like some of its landmarks, but at the same time, we see that America itself is evolving, is becoming more violent, societies are becoming more divided. So we don't want that part of America. But yes, as Geneive said, we would like a role for the United States to help in societal development, to help in education, to try to help combat the new challenges that are appearing daily on the world screen, from pandemics to diseases, to technology, to artificial intelligence. I think in those areas, the Arab world needs the United States as a partner.
Well, let's talk for a moment, if we will, on areas that we know we can cooperate on and need to. And you can't really do a panel without discussing COVID for a moment. What is the situation in the Middle East? Are there some nations that are in as much trouble as India with infection rates? Are there new variants showing up? Are you getting a handle on the COVID pandemic in any way? What is the situation?
Well, the situation, from what I read and hear and call people around, is not as bad as the horrors in India, which has really exceeded all levels. I mean, the Arab world, by and large, has a better system. It has lesser population in India, and I just don't want to go in that. There are so many issues, ethnic issues, right, communal issues, fighting and all. But by and large, while we disapproved of some of the draconian measures taken in certain parts of the Arab world, and here I'll speak about Saudi Arabia, the Emirates and others, with lockdowns, curfews and all, it bugs a lot of us, who are used to going in and out. But at the same time, it curtailed deaths, it stopped the spread of diseases. In other parts, as Egypt and North Africa and other places, while the pandemic is on, but yet I think the maturity shown by the people in society, by the ministries of health, helped a lot. And frankly speaking, I was surprised the way the Arab governments handled the pandemic. I think they did a good job. So they could get an A- or an A on that issue.
I think from where my experience is that in terms of COVID in the Arab world, it's a mixed bag because some countries have handled it better I mean, overall, especially in hindsight, and hindsight, as we know, is always 2020, it looks like generally it's been handled better than a lot of us thought in the initial stages of COVID and in the initial stages of the lockdown. And, I don't want to, blame the US for everything else that, for everything that happens elsewhere in the world. But the situation in the early stages of COVID inside the US did have some repercussions for how many parts of the Arab world handled it. There was a lot of confusion here in the US, you'll recall, as to what exactly COVID was, where it was going, when it was going to end, whether people need to be vaccinated or not, who accepted to be vaccinated and who didn't. And it became very politicized. And the US did project that image, whether it wanted to project it or not, to other parts of the world, including the Arab world.
Well, other parts of does the Arab world have a large anti-vax community?
Yeah, you hear echoes of what's happening here in the US in various Arab countries. I mean, in Morocco, for example, recently the government has been trying to introduce a passport without which you could not have access to certain public places like cafes and so on. And that's rubbing part of the population the wrong way. In Tunisia, they've had a terrible time with the repercussions of COVID, and those repercussions obviously translated into the politics in Tunisia. And part of the reason why we have the current conundrum in Tunisia is part of that was because the issue of COVID was not dealt with properly in the initial stages. So that created a lot of cases, and it created a lot of stress on the health system, and it created a lot of resentment on the part of the population that ended up supporting the measures taken by the president of Tunisia, Qais Said. But to go back to the US, and now the US is at a point where it's thinking of using the vaccines available to it to compete with the Chinese on the international stage, but also on the Arab stage. China has been very active in parts of the Arab world in terms of providing vaccines to various Arab governments. But it seems to me that the US, the Biden administration, is now trying to make hay, so to speak, of the availability of vaccines available to it as an administration. But again, it's doing that at a time when it's facing its own problems here at home. You remember Biden promised that by July, things would be under control. Well, July came and went, and things are not entirely under control. There's still a lot
it seems to be getting worse as well, that we're coming up on another period of surges. So the question, are there ample vaccines in the Middle East? Are the United States vaccines superior, equal, or to the Chinese?
Just quickly, because I'll let others speak. And here I come back to my original point. Perception is very important. It's how the US is perceived. Its vaccines will be perceived, it seems to me. And the US is generally still perceived as having a superior quality kind of vaccines to offer to the Arab world. Many Arabs, at least in the parts of the Arab world that I hear from, when you offer them Chinese vaccines, they feel a little queasy about Chinese vaccines. They want American, or at least they still want Western vaccines. They prefer them over Chinese vaccines. And it seems to me, I don't know how scientifically supported that choice can be, but it seems to me that perception plays a big role in it.
I know. I actually don't.
If I could just.
I was coming to you, Genevieve.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add that, the COVID situation is not just about what vaccine is available, but it's also, if you look at Lebanon and Egypt, for example, a lot of physicians have fled the country and nurses. Egypt, I think the figure is 50,000 physicians and nurses have fled the country. In Lebanon, there were just reports this week that physicians have fled the country. So it's not the problem.
Have they fled the country because of the politics of the region, violence in the country, or have they fled?
No, they have fled. No, they fled the country because of the economic crisis and because of the dysfunctional health systems. So even if vaccines are available, I mean, it's reaching the point where there are few people to administer them. So it's not just a matter of what vaccine is available. It's a matter of the dire health systems in some of the countries in the Middle East, not the Gulf, of course, where the health systems are much better than in countries such as Egypt, Iraq, or Lebanon. But many health workers have left the countries. They're seeking work elsewhere because of the conditions. So the problem is much more administering vaccine, because there is, people there are dying because there aren't health workers, people who are dying for many other medical reasons.
What about variants? Have there been variants of the original COVID-19 virus that are starting to show up?
Yes. And that's, if you can imagine that we've been very taxed in the United States to even deal with these variants. In the Middle East, it's much worse. And we don't even know. I mean, the other thing we need to keep in mind is that we don't really know the rate of COVID infections, because there's a lot of evidence to indicate that governments are not really aware. They can't track the number of COVID infections. They can't track the number of deaths. And so we don't really know the extent of the virus in countries like Lebanon, Iraq. And so we should assume that even the situation is much worse than we might imagine.
Wow. Mr. Almaeena, what do you think people on the street are thinking about when it comes to this? Are they looking to the United States to send more vaccine? Could we be proactive in that? Or, I mean, is it a fearsome problem?
I think it depends on which part of the Arab world you are. As Geneive said, in the Gulf, which is cushioned by cash flow and revenue and a better health system compared to the other Arab countries, or at least some of the Arab countries, there is no cause for alarm because people are buying it. In certain parts of the Gulf, the Chinese vaccines are in fashion, if I may say that. Yesterday, we heard or saw a Reuters report, I think, where the Chinese donated 500,000 vaccines to Syria. They're donating it to other countries. I don't think so there's an alarm or that people are waiting for help from the U.S. to come. Also, some of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and others, also bought vaccine and sent them to Tunisia. Over 1 million vaccines were sent by Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, Kuwait, and also we have alleviated these causes for concern and alarm as far as vaccines are concerned. But again, I think the vaccines are part of the vaccine information war between the major companies, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca. Rumors are floating all over. Even the media has fallen trap. Fake news is on. So the perception is not what the US can do for us, but which company or which product is much more important that we feel confident enough to take it. So it's not the US per se, but these are the companies. And as Dr. Fukara said, the Western companies, whatever country they are, whether they're from Europe or the United States, have A1 position vis-a-vis the Chinese companies.
Let me go back to an old relationship and the impact it has on the Arab world. Are the close ties between the United States and Israel, does it make it difficult for these new world Arab leaders to control their people or change the way they might think towards us? Does it hurt our persona there?
I think the United States, which was viewed as a beacon of democracy, goodwill, which fought against the rising tyranny post-World War II, that image is now receding because we would like to see the United States as an honest broker. The U.S., which was a signatory of UN resolutions 242 and 338, calling for 1967 determined a two-state solution. Yes, by receding away from that platform, the U.S. now is viewed with suspicion. Now, there are some people who would say, okay, we'll go ahead. But by and large, and I talk as somebody who moves around and meeting people from all segments of society, I think it's very important for the United States to be viewed as a broker, an honest broker. And whatever the U.S. does, while claiming to be a great friend, unless this thorny issue of the Palestinian problem is not resolved, I do not think so. There will be any major change, however much we try. The other issue is also a recent issue of Iraq, the attack on Iraq, coming up about the situation, the weapons of mass destruction, Afghanistan. You have to view what these young people say, not young and even middle age, say, why are we being killed? When people talk about deaths, we all agree that any death, be it an American death or an Arab death or any death, is really nobody wishes for. But what we want is long-range peace. And you cannot have long-range peace without these thorny issues that have been created.
Well, what is the solution then to a person's problem with our relationship with the Palestinians? What has to happen to satisfy those people who question our... Go ahead.
I think the United States, which has the clout, we think they have the clout, is to call for a two-state solution, which they agree, come up with those parties in Israel, and there are many of them, help evolve, create a real roadmap, you see, not something, phony, to come up to reach to that. So the aspiring people, both sides will live in peace. And there are many Israelis also who would want that. So unless you create a conducive, atmosphere, by moving the embassy to Jerusalem did not help. Crazy statements by certain American policymakers do not help. So in order to go forward, I think is to get both the points. Believe me, nobody wants war. Nobody wants conflict. Every person would like to spend a peaceful night rather than wake up to guns or bombs and all. Once that is and the U.S. can, I've talked to many people in Congress and elsewhere, but what they say in private, they cannot say in public. If they just come out and get these two people together, I think that will be the issue, and it will remove a lot of bitterness, about the United States.
Rick, if I may, and allow me as an Arab to use a metaphor. The Arabic language is a great language because it allows for the unique use of metaphors. There is a well from which both the Arabs and the United States have been drinking for a long time. And there's, in my experience, there's nothing that has poisoned that well as badly as two things. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, regardless of how people felt about Saddam Hussein and some of the very bad things that he did in the neighborhood and to his own people.
Are you talking about the first invasion?
No, I'm talking about 2003.
Okay.
And so obviously what the US did in 2003 caused a lot of pain in the Arab world, particularly when other Arabs see normal Iraqis, and what they've been going through since 2003, their children, their old men and women, and the killings and so on of civilians and so on and so forth. So that has poisoned the well. The other thing that has poisoned the well of U.S. Arab relations for a long time is obviously, as you've indicated, is the Arab-Israeli conflict, now reduced by many Arabs themselves to the appellation the Palestinian Israeli conflict. What I know from the Palestinians so far is that they have been very resilient, despite all the problems that they've had with occupation over the last 70 years or so. They've become thick-skinned. They do see now their fortunes, or the fortunes of their cause. They've seen it change, especially since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, where not so much attention has been paid to it. And then we've had the string of normalizations with Israel in recent times. The moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which surprised, the reaction of Arabs to it surprised even Trump, if we take him at his word. He said that he expected that the move would be accompanied by huge protests across the Arab and Muslim world, and that didn't happen. However, the fact that didn't happen does not change the fact that a solution has to be found to it, and that solution, many Palestinians, many Israelis, many Americans feel that the two-state solution that's being talked about is maybe not a viable solution anymore. And therefore, I expect, this issue will continue to.
So what is a viable solution? If not a two-state solution, what is a viable solution for those people?
Well, that's what nobody at this particular point in time knows or wants to consider. A one democratic state for Jews and Palestinians is obviously a non-starter for many Israelis. And let's face it, with the power that the Israelis have, both domestically and regionally, especially now with the string of normalizations, if the Israelis are not amenable to that, I don't see how it's going to happen. And the Biden administration, it continues to push for a two-state solution. I don't see how the Biden administration or any future U.S. administration will be in a position to actually impose something that the Israelis themselves do not want. Let me just conclude by saying this.
Okay, if I could just please interject.
Let me just say this. Let me just say this, please. You can plan politics. You can not plan history. Whether you're Israeli or American or Arab, you can plan, you can say, this is what I want to happen. Arab presidents, planned to stay in power for a long time. In the end, they got toppled. You cannot plan history. You don't know the twists of history, what they're going to do to you. So I do not know what next year or the year after, where the Israeli Palestinian moods will be when it comes to a settlement.
I think we know that you
I think it's very important to. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to say that it's very important that the U.S. continue to pursue a two-state solution, irrespective of which faction or coalition is in power in Israel. And I think it's important not to generalize Israeli public opinion, because there's a large part of Israeli public opinion, in fact, that does still advocate a two-state solution. The other point I'd like to make is that if you look historically over the last 30 years, a lot of Arab societies have never really cared that much about the Palestinian cause, as tragic as it might seem. I mean, when I was on the streets in Cairo in the 1990s, the only time Egyptians ever talked about the Palestinian cause was as a way to demonstrate on the streets against Mubarak. So this is not a new development. I mean, the Palestinian cause is a tired complaint among a lot of Arab societies, and it's never really had importance. And so to say now that, well, it doesn't have importance and therefore we have to resign ourselves to a one-state solution is really a misleading kind of assumption. And so I think it's very important that the United States pursue a two-state solution, and it's not correct to try to evaluate Israeli public opinion based upon the manipulations of Israeli politicians. I think also if the United States gives up on a two-state solution, that would be a very tragic development in the Middle East. And those Arabs who do care about the Palestinian cause would definitely use this as ammunition against the United States. And let's not forget that this has been a very important cause. If it's not been one for average Arabs, it's certainly been a cause that has been instrumentalized by extremist groups. So it's not, I think it's very much a mistake to try to argue that the United States needs to give up on a two-state solution simply because that might be what the Israeli political elites want.
Genevieve, I agree with your precautions. I'm not making any pronouncement or statement on whether the two-state solution is still viable or not, or whether a one-state solution is the way forward. I don't know, but I know one thing. I was in the West Bank. I have been in the West Bank in the past, and traveling around the West Bank, watching the construction of settlements, you know, it was obvious, at least to me personally, and you know, I could be completely wrong, but it was obvious to me that with that kind of scale of settlement building, it is becoming increasingly difficult to see how a two-state solution could actually come about. But let me just end by reiterating what I said at the end of my remarks last time, which is that you can plan politics, but you cannot plan history. You know, the Biden administration could plan to continue with the two-state solution drive. A future administration could have something different to offer. I don't know. But ultimately, you know, control over history, and I hope I'm not sounding too philosophical, control of history is neither in the hands of Israelis, Palestinians, Americans, or anybody else. We don't know what history will bring ultimately to this issue. But just judging on the facts as I've experienced them myself with the scale of settlement, it seems to me that the two-state solution is really having a hard time coming into being.
But nobody of import, it seems, really thinks that a one-state solution can solve any problems, that you couldn't get a buy-off. You know, you're not going to get the Palestinians to buy on to that. Well, they might, the Palestinians may buy onto it, the Israelis may buy onto it, but the details would be devastating. I
mean, I don't have any figures. Genevieve just talked about the Israelis. I don't have any figures to support this. I get a sense that, you know, obviously the Israeli political spectrum is a very rich spectrum, but I don't know if there is a strong enough majority of Israelis who favor a one-state solution. I don't believe there are enough American Jews who favor a one-state solution because they see it as a threat to the future of Israel. And therefore, this big question mark as to what this administration will achieve with its drive for a two-state solution will lead to, I don't know what the next administration will do. It's a big question mark for me.
But with the change in government in Israel, with Netanyahu out or the hardliner out, do you see this as something that might help negotiations, that might help the situation? Genevieve, Mr. Maine?
I think that one point to understand is, that the whole strategy of Israel, whether it's been under Netanyahu or otherwise, has been to change the facts on the ground. And when you talk about settlement building, yes, I mean, that's a perfect example of changing the facts on the ground. So if we succumb to the Israeli strategy, which has been employed at least for a decade, of changing the facts on the ground, then we're basically saying, okay, we're helpless, we can't do anything, we'll allow more settlement building because that's a fait accompli. And so I think that we have to talk about the causes of how we got to this point, rather than just accepting the situation as it exists now. So I think that policy needs to consider how we got to this point, who is responsible, how the Palestinians have been affected by the creation of these facts on the ground. As the settlement building has gone on, I mean, the United States government has not really done all that much to stop it. And so I think that has to be considered, as well as a whole complex of issues that have affected the Palestinians, because frankly, the international community has not tried to take the kinds of action necessary to stop these kinds of facts on the ground.
Well, if I may add, I think we forgot one of the main actors. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we might also not overlook the resilience of the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been, unfortunate. The leadership, there has to be a sea change in the leadership. Younger people should come in who are eloquent, who can speak out their minds. There are people who can follow the Gandhian philosophy of nonviolence, do up things in the West Bank. Also, let's not forget the intra-Palestinian conflict between Gaza and the West Bank, the political conflict. I think there has to be a total Palestinian solution so that it can come up at par and sit across the table with those like-minded Israelis who would like to have peace, because I agree a one-state solution is absolutely out of the question, because in the long range it will cause more problems. I truly believe a two-state solution based on equal rights and secure borders, but these are not just words, but I think that there should be a total change, and it's not for me to say that. Younger Palestinian voices, more eloquent, more professional, more political savvy, should be able to come and speak out, rather than those voices that we have been hearing from for decades.
Who, if I was going to go negotiate today, who is the negotiating power on the Palestinian side, and do they have real influence?
Well, there are many. I mean, there are people like Ramzi Baroud, who's outside. There are other people inside. I've heard of a couple of them who are living in the States, not necessarily those within the borders of Palestine or Israel. They can get a lot of the professional Palestinians who are living in the United States and Canada and in Australia. And there are a lot of them who will come and talk over and be able to and get the support of the masses, because people are really tired. We meet a lot of Palestinians outside, and they're just tired of the same faces, the same statements, and some of the corruption that goes on. So the new faces are there. And I'm sure at the drop of a hat, they'll be coming up and are ready to come and serve their people.
I think we're starting to approach the end of this session. Nobody has told me otherwise. Dr. Anthony, is there a thought you would like to make?
Thank you, Rick. This would be a question having to do with monetary influence on Arab media. It's a consensus, it seems, you can correct me if I'm in error, that the overwhelming majority of the income for publications, print, broadcast media, and otherwise, comes not from subscribers or individual viewers as much as it comes from advertisers. And advertisers have no restraints or constraints in terms of holding or withholding their advertising contributions to the financial viability of media. Would any of the resource specialists focus on this dynamic? What is similar, if at all, and what is different? And if different, how profoundly different? And what are the implications of the flow of revenue income to the media that is centerfold in terms of what people have in the way of information and insight and such knowledge and understanding as passes for conventional wisdom?
And let's also ask our panelists to make some concluding remarks.
Yes.
So why don't we begin with the lady? Why don't we begin with Geneive?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting discussion. My only comment is that I think that the United States will always be engaged in the Middle East in some form or another. And it probably is not an either or situation. Will the United States become more engaged in China, and therefore will it make it less engaged in the Middle East? I think that the relationship historically has cemented some involvement. And I think that Arabs look to the United States for a lot of things, not just occupation and military presence, but they look to the United States culturally. They look to the United States for visionary purposes. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind rather than to create this sort of dichotomy of the United States will become more involved in China or elsewhere and therefore less engaged in the Middle East, because I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Mr.
I agree. Oh, sorry.
You go next.
Well, I think, as was said, I think the United States and the Arab world should have a strong relationship, and they should now focus rather than just be buyers of arms and others. We should focus on technology to face these new challenges that are fast creeping up, to rehab the Arab educational system, to raise the standard of awareness, health-wise, societal-wise, and other ways. This is very important. The United States can play a big role, but it's not the only place. Now, the Arab world is also looking towards the Far East, towards Japan, Korea, and all, which has a sort of decent type of technology and scientific breakthroughs. So I think, yes, we have an emotional attachment. Many Arabs have studied in the United States. They like the United States. But as I said earlier, we should have to deal with a country that we feel comfortably with and not have this dichotomy between politics and society. So there should be a sympathetic view of the Arabs. The Islamophobia in the United States, you stop. The hatred, John Dukes talked about media. When I'm appalled when I read the US media and respectable papers down there say such, and I'm a media man myself, outright lies. So I think there should be a meeting of the minds between the American intelligentsia and the Arab intelligentsia, and guilds should meet with guilds, associations with associations, and we create a conducive climate of peace and understanding that we are in this fight against the environmental damages, against other things together. I think that would be the key issue that we should face when we deal with the United States.
Okay, and Dr. Vacara, we end with you, and it's the end of the session, so briefly, please.
You're not going to hear anything fundamentally different from me. I agree. The US can walk and chew gum. It can focus on China and continue its engagement in the Middle East. And by the way, when we say the Middle East, we don't mean just the Arabs. There are the Iranians, the Persians, there are the Israelis, there are the Turks, there are other groups. And there's a third thing that has poisoned the well of US-Arab relations, obviously, and that's the 9/11 attacks, the issue of withdrawing from Afghanistan, harks back to that. And for that alone, the United States will not be able to completely disengage. Not that any American is thinking of completely disengaging from the Middle East, but the Middle East and the United States, it seems to me, are destined to continue their relationship. That relationship has, as we heard from Mr. Khaled earlier, that relationship has to be recalibrated here and there, but the US can definitely walk and chew gum at the same time.
All right, so I think we need to leave it there. And with that, I thank you all very much for taking part. And Dr. Anthony, the ball is yours.
Thank you, sir. It's been an excellent discussion. And I think you have put the dynamic and phenomenon of the force, the factor of China in a much more relevant, timely, and understandable context. This relationship between the United States and the Arab region, at least 7 decades and counting. The one with China is new, far less deep, not nearly as high, hardly as broad, and as diverse and rich. There are just in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf region, 1 million Arab graduates of American institutions of higher education. And as Khaled Almaeena rightly said, there is this positive bias, for lack of a better word, or rather emotional attachment by these graduates who came to the United States, lived here firsthand, Thanksgiving, Christmases, other holidays, at the most impressionable stage in their lives, 16 to 23 years, something like that. There is no remotely comparable phenomenon present, let alone having influence coming from Moscow or elsewhere in the Soviet Union or Russia or China, nor is there likely to be in the foreseeable future for all of us involved in this session. On matters of war and peace, of strategic might, of an ability to dispatch for humanitarian crises, tsunamis and earthquakes and others, Russia and China have no experience like that, and no remotely capable or comparable capacity to perform such feats. So it's not just the military by any means. On the economic front, yes, China is the fast-moving train on the inside lane, so to speak. But if these figures are reasonably correct, that the United States annual GDP somewhere $21 trillion, China's is something like 18. So that's a spread of $3 trillion annually between the two. So yes, catching up, but nowhere near, and nowhere near to be nearly in sight. Secondly, with regard to trade, investment, and commerce, business in general, most of the joint ventures in the capital area, public and private sector, are between Arab companies, corporations, institutions, and their American counterparts, not their Chinese or Russian counterparts there. On the military aspects, of 42% of all of the arms exports to the entire Arab region, from Morocco to Muscat, Baghdad to Berbera, Algiers to Aden and Alexandria and Aleppo, in between, are American manufactured. 4 or 5 major US Fortune 100 companies. There's no even distant, faint whisper or echo of that kind of effectiveness coming from Russia or from China, even though France and Great Britain, of course, remain active in this area as well. But China does not seek, to my knowledge, to become the military hegemon in the region, to be an increasingly important, dynamic, beneficial, reciprocally rewarded economic partner. Yes, but that's completely different from the other. China would more likely, in my view, correct me if I'm wrong, be seen as an ascendant player and a participant and an activist and an engager, but not a threat, not an adversary, not a country to be over-criticized in terms of what it is doing and not doing in the region that affects not just the people in the region, but the United States in particular, and the global situation as a whole. So I will let these concluding remarks rest on their merits, and invite challenge or corrections or comment and input from many of our resource specialists. This has been an extraordinary team of professionals who have carved out time from their busy schedules to exhibit, manifest their convictions, and display their commitments. Many of us have innumerable convictions, but we must limit, prioritize their commitments. And look what these four have done for the past hour in their commitment to enhance American awareness, appreciation, and understanding on one hand, and Arab understanding, awareness, and appreciation on the other, of the opportunities, the achievements, the accomplishments, the complexities, and the issues at hand that beg for greater insight, knowledge, and understanding. You've helped us all come closer to achieving that objective, and accordingly, we are in your debt. Thank you all.